And guys, in this next news story, 3 men, including a father and son, have been jailed for life for the murder of a teenage boy who was stabbed to death. Callum Riley, who was only 17 years old, may he rest in peace, was lured to the family home of a drug dealer who he had become embroiled in a tit-for-tat feud with over a £180 drugs debt. Hours earlier, Tony Adams had smashed the windows of Callum's home in Heywood, where he lived with his mother and siblings. Callum was then fueled by anger, so him and his friend both went to Adams's home, who was a known drug dealer, armed with glass bottles, and began launching them at his property in the early of September the 17th, 2022. A fracas ensued in which Callum and his friend were both stabbed. Callum was able to stagger away from the scene, but collapsed and died shortly after. His friend survived. Dale Heywood, who was Adam's friend, who had been called to his home to act as a backup, was probably the man who stabbed Callum, the prosecutor stated at Manchester Crown Court. He claimed to have blacked out after being hit on the head with a bottle, only to be later told by Adams that he'd stabbed someone. Adams, who's 34, and his son, Niall Conaghan, who's 18, were also charged with murder. Adams admitted that he armed himself with a baseball bat as the men arrived at his home, but claimed that he'd been acting in self-defense. Following a trial in March this year, they were each found guilty of murder, and also convicted was Adams' partner, who was convicted of assisting an offender as she cleaned up the crime scene. So the court heard that Callum and Adams had become involved in a row which began months earlier when he had bought £180 worth of weed from him and failed to repay the debt. A tit-for-tat feud broke out, which ended with Callum's murder. Reading an emotional victim impact statement, Callum's dad said, "I've always been proud of all my children, and Callum was no different. He had started working and making his own way in the world. He was becoming a man I admired." Looking to the doc, he added, "You should never have to bury one of your children. It's not the natural way of life. When you have children, you want them to grow up well, but he will never get married or have a family of his own, and will never forgive those people that are responsible for this." A statement from his mother said, "We hoped he would grow up happy. Sadly, this will never be. He will never have a family of his own. He will never have pre-planned holidays or go out with his friends. I brought him into this world. It shouldn't have happened this way. Instead of decorating a venue for his 18th, I decorated his grave. My family is broken. I look at the clock and think he will be home soon, and then my heart breaks all over again." And his girlfriend also said, "I feel like a piece of me is missing. It's a pain I've never felt before. I can't understand why he would be taken away from me." So, in defence for Tony Adams, his solicitor said this was a spat of sorts between one young defendant and Callum Riley at an earlier stage that led to a series of events that culminated in a horrific attack. He has expressed some reports and insight. The defence for Niall Conaghan said that it was following directions from his dad. He said that when his father told him to do something, he did it. Sentencing him, Judge Patrick Field KC said this case represents a tragedy as yet another young person has met a violent and premature death as a consequence of a knife. Callum Riley received a fatal stab wound to his left leg and died alone in the garden of a house. He was only 17 years old. He was just a child. Tony Adams, it was your idea to teach Callum a lesson and put him in his place. You picked this fight with a child. You provoked him deliberately. You chose to engage him in a direct and violent confrontation. A 33-year-old man and a 17-year-old child. Ultimately, this all could have been avoided by simply keeping the door closed. So Adams was jailed for life to serve a minimum of 24 years after being convicted of murder and causing GBH with intent. Niall Conaghan was detained for life to serve a minimum of 8 years after being convicted of murder and causing GBH with intent. Dale Heywood, the pal who actually came down to help out, was jailed for life to serve a minimum of 24 years after being convicted of murder and causing GBH with intent. This is the minimum term they're going to be serving before the parole board decides whether to release them or not. And the partner of Tony Adams, she was basically handed a 9-month imprisonment, but it's been suspended for 18 months. Senior Investigating Officer Detective Inspector Louise Edwards of Greater Manchester Police's Major Investigations Team said, "Today is the culmination of an extensive investigation into the murder of Callum. Firstly, I want to be clear that this was not a case of self-defence. Tony Adams set in motion a chain of violent events when he planned and welcomed a confrontation with a teenager. Adams, Dale, and Niall were armed with weapons including a knife and a baseball bat in the expectation of violence they had planned for and hoped would start. They created a situation in which Callum would come to their house, arm themselves, and open the door rather than calling the police. Those violent actions have devastated so many lives, and the family and friends of Callum have had to face the loss of a loved one in such terrible circumstances. My thoughts are with them today, and whilst the sentences imposed can never undo what has been done, I hope it will bring some form of closure. I'd also like to thank the investigation team for their hard work during this complex investigation and the prosecution team in building the strongest possible case. Detective Sergeant Adam Hitchens said Tony Adams, Dale Heywood and Niall Conahan robbed a teenager of his life and future when they committed this senseless and violent crime over £180 cannabis debt. Callum did not deserve to die, and there are no justifications for their actions. He said, I would like to thank Callum's family for their courage and dignity throughout this investigation. I would also like to pay tribute to the witnesses who have assisted Greater Manchester Police in our investigation. He said, this is another example of a tragic consequence of knife crime. I would like to use this case to issue an appeal against carrying knives. Had weapons not been used that night, we might not be here today. Knives can have a terrible fatal consequence for victims and offenders, and I urge you to think very carefully about the risk and not carry knives. Once again, I just want to say rest in peace to the victim, and my condolences go out to your family. And in this next news story, detectives used CCTV to identify a killer who carried out a brutal attack on a woman in Edmonton. Decker Omar was found guilty of murdering 58-year-old Susan Ayunu following a retrial at Snaresbrook Crown Court. Today, she was sentenced to 23 years in prison at the Inner London Crown Court. Detective Inspector Jim Barry said Susan was kind and generous, supporting those around her, even though she had very little. One of those people she helped was Omar, who wanted more and violently killed Susan while she was in a place of safety, which was her own home. Police were called at around 8:32 on 21st of February 2022 to reports that a body of a woman had been found at a residential property. Officers attended alongside paramedics. However, the woman, later identified as Susan, was pronounced dead at the scene, and a post-mortem examination later established the cause of death as traumatic head and chest injuries with compression of the neck. An investigation was launched to establish the circumstances leading up to Susan's death, and it was through CCTV and witness statements that officers managed to trace Omar's movements to the address the night before Susan was discovered. Following initial inquiries, officers discovered that Omar had befriended Susan, visiting her property on numerous occasions, and she had preyed on Susan's kind nature in order to fund her own drug addiction. While it is unclear what the motive of the attack was, Susan's injuries are found to be the result of a brutal and violent attack which included strangulation, stamping on her, and a number of heavy blows to her face. Omar stole Susan's phone before leaving the property. Omar was subsequently arrested on suspicion of murder on February the 22nd, 2022, and later charged with the same offence. I just want to say rest in peace, Susan, and my condolences go out to your family. Here's a number of stories coming out from the streets of the UK. It's your boy GT. Keep it locked, keep it real.